The morning air in the small American town of Massachusetts carried the unmistakable crispness of early autumn. Leaves crunched under hurried footsteps, scarves fluttered in the breeze, and clouds hovered low, promising rain. Among the sea of students streaming toward campus, one figure moved quietly, unnoticed by most, yet utterly distinct. Sylvie Rama adjusted her white hijab, tucking the corner beneath her coat with practiced grace. Her steps were slow, deliberate, each one weighed down by something heavier than just the books in her bag. As she passed rows of students chatting in fluent English, her presence stood out. Her soft brown skin, the calm eyes shaped by Southeast Asian lineage, the fabric that wrapped her hair and dignity, all of it made her unmistakably foreign. But it wasn't just nationality that set her apart. It was belief. It was the unwavering light of faith that she carried in a place where such convictions were often dissected, doubted, and sometimes derided. Sylvie was enrolled in the philosophy program, not an easy choice, and certainly not a comfortable one. But her heart had always been drawn to understanding, to questioning, but also defending what she knew was true. The class she dreaded most was world philosophy and moral reasoning, taught by the charismatic but controversially liberal Professor Williams. The syllabus promised rigorous debate, cultural comparisons, and deep dives into ethics. What it didn't promise, but delivered anyway, was ridicule. From the very first week, Sylvie found herself at the center of jokes that weren't quite jokes. One student scoffed. "Religion is just mankind's bedtime story before science tucked them in." The room erupted in laughter. Sylvie had looked up briefly from her notebook, her fingers instinctively tightening around the small Qur'an she always kept beside her. But the loudest voice in that room belonged to a tall, broad-shouldered young man named Samuel. He was confident, even charming, in a disarming, sharp-tongued kind of way. His essays were quoted by the professor. His opinions, no matter how abrasive, were taken seriously. And he had one obvious target, Sylvie. For Samuel, religion was not just false, it was dangerous. He would often turn discussions into direct provocations. "I just can't understand," he said one day while discussing morality, "how a modern, educated woman can still choose to cover herself like she's ashamed of her existence." The class turned to look at Sylvie. A few chuckled under their breath. Professor Williams smiled awkwardly, saying nothing. Sylvie lowered her eyes. Not because she was ashamed, never because of that, but because she was trying to hold the storm inside her. Her lips moved in silent dhikr, Ya Sabor, Ya Latif, O most patient, O subtle one. She wanted to speak. Every fiber of her being urged her to. She could explain what hijab meant. She could talk about choice, dignity, modesty, resistance to objectification. But this wasn't the time. Not yet. Then came a moment that shattered her composure. Samuel pointed at the small Qur'an on her desk and said with a half-smile, "And the most hilarious part is, they actually think this book written in the desert 1,400 years ago can answer today's problems." This time, the laughter was louder. One student slapped the desk. Another leaned back, smirking. And still, the professor said nothing. Sylvie's eyes closed. Her breath trembled. But she didn't cry. Instead, she gripped her Qur'an like a soldier grips a sword, not out of fear, but out of fierce restraint. She stood up. Her chair made a soft creak. The laughter stopped. The room stilled. All eyes turned toward her. Sylvie's voice was soft, but steady. Her accent faint, but her words clear. "Enough," she said. There was no shout. No theatrics. But there was a gravity in her voice that pulled every gaze back into focus. "You can insult me," she continued. "Laugh at my clothes, my background, even my silence. But do not insult the Qur'an." Samuel raised an eyebrow, amused. Sylvie didn't blink. "If you truly believe in your logic and reasoning, then I challenge you," she said. "A debate. Right here." Tomorrow. In front of the class. You ask your questions, and I will answer, with reason, evidence, and respect. Murmurs rippled across the room. A girl in the back whispered, "Is she serious?" Samuel let out a quiet chuckle. "Sure," he said, leaning back. "I love a good challenge. Especially an easy one." But Sylvie was not challenging for pride. She wasn't defending her ego. This was about faith, about a sacred truth that had been mocked not because it was false, but because it dared to remain firm in a world of shifting values. That night, Sylvie returned to her small apartment near campus. She didn't eat. She didn't message her family. She didn't even touch her textbooks. She laid her muse half gently on her prayer mat and prayed longer than usual. "Ya Allah," she whispered with her forehead pressed to the ground. "Don't let this be about me. Let this be for your sake. Guide me to speak the truth. And let that truth be enough." Outside, the wind howled through the trees like a distant call to battle. Inside, her room was silent, but the light within her heart glowed quietly, resolutely, like a candle braving the night. The morning sky wore a gray veil, mirroring the heaviness in Sylvie Rama's heart. The air was unusually still, almost as if the entire town knew something important was about to unfold. As she stood in front of the mirror, carefully wrapping her hijab, her fingers trembled slightly. But in her reflection, she didn't see fear, she saw resolve. "This isn't about winning," she whispered to herself. "It's about standing." She tucked her small Qur'an into her bag and headed out. By the time she arrived at the philosophy building, whispers had already spread. "Did you hear? The hijabi girl challenged Samuel. It's going to be a slaughter." What was she thinking? The classroom was fuller than ever. Not just enrolled students, but others too, from different departments, curious to witness the unlikely spectacle. A Muslim girl in hijab debating the most ruthless atheist in the philosophy faculty. Samuel was already there. Relaxed. Smirking. His laptop open, notes fanned across the desk like weapons laid out before battle. He glanced at Sylvie when she entered and gave a slight, mocking nod. She ignored him. She walked to her seat, placed the Qur'an beside her, and took a deep breath. Professor Williams cleared his throat, visibly tense. "Today's session will be a continuation of our moral reasoning unit, though it's clear this has now evolved into a wider dialogue." He glanced toward Samuel and Sylvie. "We begin with a question: is Islam, or religion at large, compatible with modern ethics?" He gestured to Samuel. "You may begin." Samuel stood casually, scanning the room with the confidence of a performer before an eager audience. "Let's not pretend," he began. "Religion, especially Islam, is a relic of a violent past. A system born in the desert that continues to control, divide, and restrict. You want proof?" He held up a printed verse. Surah An-Nisa, verse 34. It says a man can hit his wife. Legalize domestic violence. How is this compatible with any modern ethical system? The room buzzed with nervous energy. Sylvie remained still. Then she rose. "I was expecting that verse," she said calmly. "Let's begin with context. The Quran doesn't promote violence, it restricts it. That verse speaks of responsibility, not permission. The Arabic word daraba has multiple meanings: to separate, to leave, to strike lightly as a warning, and scholars have debated it for centuries. But one thing is clear: the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, never laid a hand on any of his wives." Some students began taking notes. Others looked uncertain. Sylvie continued, her voice steadier now. "Before Islam, newborn girls were buried alive. Women were property, not people. Islam came and gave them inheritance rights, consent in marriage, the right to education. That verse wasn't meant to oppress, it was meant to reform." Samuel chuckled. "You can dress it up however you want. But covering your body, hiding your hair, that's not empowerment. That's submission. Sylvie smiled softly. You're right. It is submission. But not to men. Not to society. I choose to submit to God. She turned slightly to the class. The hijab isn't a cage. It's a shield. In Surah Nur, verse 31, we're told to cover, not to hide, but to honor. I choose not to be an object. I'm more than my hair. More than my body. And that, to me, is freedom. A quiet settled over the class. One of the girls in the back, who had giggled in earlier sessions, now stared at Sylvie with a look that wasn't mockery, but curiosity. But Samuel wasn't done. Oh, come on, he said, leaning forward. Let's talk about jihad. Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 191. Kill the disbelievers. That's terrorism, plain and simple. Sylvie nodded. Yes. Let's talk about it. But let's not cut verses in half. She opened her Qur'an. This verse was revealed during a time when Muslims were driven from their homes, attacked for their faith. It says, fight in the way of God those who fight you, but do not transgress limits. Even in war, Islam forbids harming women, children, the elderly, even trees. Prophet Muhammad laid strict rules for combat. Islam isn't terrorism. It's justice. Samuel scoffed. If it's so just, then why so many rules? Why so many restrictions? Can't we decide for ourselves what's right and wrong? Sylvie's eyes met his. That's the problem, she said. We have. And look where it's taken us: depression, loneliness, moral confusion. Islam doesn't restrict, it redirects. To something higher. She opened her muse half again. Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 2. This is the book about which there is no doubt, a guidance for the God-conscious. It's not a prison. It's a map. The class was silent. For the first time, Samuel didn't respond immediately. Sylvie sat down, her heart pounding. Professor Williams looked at his watch but didn't interrupt. Then, with forced amusement, Samuel said, Okay. But quoting verses isn't proof. That's memorization. Not reasoning. Sylvie stood again. Her voice now had a new edge, still calm, but unshakable. You think I just memorize? I understand. Surah Yunus, verse 57, O mankind, there has come to you an instruction from your Lord, and a healing for what is in the hearts. This book, this message, it's not a lecture. It's a lifeline. Samuel blinked. He looked at his notes, flipping pages, but the rhythm was breaking. His grip was loosening. The class watched him. Some leaned forward. Others looked, intrigued. Sylvie looked at the professor. With your permission, she said, I'd like to finish with one thing. He nodded. She turned to Samuel, but spoke to everyone. You ask why I believe? Because I've tasted the world without faith. And I've seen what life looks like without purpose. But when I opened the Qur'an, I found peace. Surah Ar-Raid, verse 28, Verily, in the remembrance of Allah do hearts find rest. That's why I'm here. That's why I'll stand, no matter who laughs. Then she sat down. The class didn't erupt in applause. It didn't need to. It was silent, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any sound. And in that silence, something unspoken began to shift. That night, the classroom buzzed even after everyone had left. The debate wasn't just talked about, it was felt. On campus forums, in coffee shops, even in dorm group chats, Sylvie's name echoed like a riddle. How did she stay so calm? Did you hear how she answered that verse thing? She actually made Samuel look cornered. But Sylvie didn't bask in any of it. She returned home, placed her Qur'an back on the prayer mat, and wept, not from fear or exhaustion, but gratitude. Ya Allah, she whispered, forehead pressed to the ground. I am nothing without you. If any heart was moved today, it was by your words, not mine. The next morning dawned cold and wet, with the sky still burdened by clouds. The campus remained alive with tension. Students who usually walked past each other now exchanged knowing glances. Something had changed, and everyone felt it, even if they couldn't name it. Inside the philosophy hall, anticipation sat heavy in the air. The seats were once again packed, some people standing along the walls. Professor Williams seemed more nervous than usual, his voice hoarser, his fingers fidgeting with his pen. But it wasn't just academic anxiety. It was the awareness that a shift was happening in his class, not in thought alone, but in spirit. Samuel entered just before the bell. No grin today. No swagger. But he held something, a tablet covered in highlighted notes, citations from Bertrand Russell, Hitchens, Darwin, Freud, a fortress of Western rationalism, tightly built and well-armed. Sylvie arrived early and quietly, as always. This time, she brought only one thing, her muse half, neatly bound in soft green, with corners worn from use and love. She placed it in front of her like a shield. The professor cleared his throat. Today's focus, he began, is the relationship between religion and science. Between revelation and empirical evidence. Our question, can Islam, a religion, stand shoulder to shoulder with modern reason? He turned to Samuel. You may begin. Samuel stood tall, but his energy had changed. More rigid now. More forced. He clicked the tablet on. Before we begin romanticizing the past, let's ask something basic, he said. If God is all-powerful, why would he create humans with the capacity to sin? Isn't that a design flaw? A few students nodded slightly. Sylvie didn't react immediately. She took her time, not stalling, but preparing. Then she rose. No flaw, she said gently. But freedom. She looked at Samuel. A perfect being could have created robots, creatures without will, without error, without growth. But humans were given something greater, choice. Surah Al-Insan, verse 3, we showed him the path, he can choose gratitude or denial. Free will is not a weakness in the design. It is the proof of divine love. Samuel shook his head. But then you say if someone makes the wrong choice, God throws them into hell. That doesn't sound like love. That sounds like tyranny. Sylvie's expression didn't change. You're a student of logic, right? She said. Tell me this, can love exist without justice? Can a parent allow their child to harm others and call it mercy? She paused. Then quoted quietly. Surah Al-Araf, verse 156, my mercy encompasses all things. Hell is not the desire of God. It is the result of repeated rejection. The door is always open, but it is we who walk away. A hush settled over the room. Then Samuel said, louder this time, all right. Then let's talk facts. You want to prove this is the word of God? Show me one, just one, undeniable scientific miracle in your Qur'an. Just one that science confirms. The room leaned in. Sylvie didn't hesitate. Surah Al-Mu'minin, verses 12 to 14, she said. It describes the stages of human embryonic development, from dust to a drop, to a clinging clot, to a lump of flesh, all before any microscope existed. Science only confirmed these stages centuries later. Samuel scoffed. Coincidence. Metaphor. A lucky guess. Sylvie shook her head. Not a guess. Not metaphor. It matches modern embryology, exactly. And more importantly, it's preserved. Unchanged for 1,400 years. She opened to Surah An-Nisa, verse 82. Do they not reflect on the Qur'an? If it had been from any other than Allah, they would have found many contradictions in it. Silence again. Even Samuel looked briefly down. But he rallied. Oh, really? Then explain this. The Qur'an says the earth is spread out. That sounds like flat earth nonsense. Sylvie smiled slightly. Surah An-Nazi'at, verse 30, and the earth, he spread it out like an ostrich egg. The Arabic word Dawah refers to the shape of an ostrich egg, not flat, but elliptical. A geologically accurate description of Earth's shape. There was an audible gasp from a student in the second row. Samuel tried to mask his reaction with laughter. Fine. But how can you believe in something you can't see? Your God is invisible. Your heaven is invisible. Your truth is invisible. That's anti-science. Sylvie nodded thoughtfully. Can you see gravity? She asked. Samuel frowned. Can you see air? Time? Thoughts? No. But you believe in their effects. She paused. Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 3, the believers are those who believe in the unseen. Faith isn't irrational. It's recognizing there's more than the eye can see. Science tells you how. Faith tells you why. The professor shifted slightly in his chair, eyes still locked on Sylvie. Samuel was unraveling. He could feel it. He turned desperate. What about human rights? He snapped. Islam restricts sexual freedom. It condemns LGBT. You call that compassion? Sylvie's face was still, but fierce. Freedom without boundaries is not freedom. It's chaos. Surah Al-Araf, verses 80 to 81, talks about the people of Lut. Islam doesn't hate anyone, but it offers a path to inner peace. Truth isn't always easy, but it's always loving. Now the class was completely silent. No one even looked at their phones. Then Samuel asked one final time, this time not yelling, but almost whispering. Then what makes you so sure? Why bet your entire life on this? Sylvie held up her Qur'an. Her eyes glistened. Because I know what it feels like to live without direction. I've tasted that emptiness. But when I read Surah Ar-Raid, verse 28, truly, in the remembrance of Allah do hearts find rest, I knew. I didn't just read it. I felt it. The class froze. For the first time, Samuel didn't laugh. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. His lips pressed together, his fingers fidgeted with the tablet. Professor Williams stood, his voice quiet. We'll pause here. But I think what we just witnessed wasn't just a debate. It was a search for something deeper. Sylvie sat down, her heart steady now. She knew the battle wasn't over. But she also knew something had cracked inside Samuel. Not his argument. His certainty. The air outside the classroom had become cold and still, but inside, something entirely different was taking place. There were no official winners or losers declared after the debate, but every student who walked out that day knew the tide had shifted. Samuel had not replied to Sylvie's final statement. He hadn't mocked, smirked, or thrown a sarcastic jab. He had gone quiet. And that silence was louder than anything else. As Sylvie walked back to her apartment, bundled in her coat, gripping her Qur'an in one hand, she noticed something different. A girl she didn't know, one of the students who had laughed the loudest during Samuel's earlier mockery, brushed past her and whispered, "That was brave," then quickly disappeared into the crowd. That night, it rained, a soft, almost poetic drizzle tapping against the windows. Sylvie sat with her muse half open, flipping to a passage she knew by heart. Her lips moved quietly, and in the hush of her room, the words felt like they weren't just being recited, they were speaking back to her. Across town, Samuel was also awake. His desk, usually a fortress of logical frameworks and secular thought, was now cluttered with papers, but not his usual ones. He had printed verses from the Qur'an, scholarly articles about Islamic theology, and even translations of Hadiths. He hadn't told anyone. Not even himself, really. He was just checking the other side. He'd told his own reflection when he caught himself reading at 2 a.m. It's just research. But something inside him felt different. Not convinced, no, but unsettled. The next session wasn't officially a debate, but it didn't matter. The students came in droves. The professor had to prop open windows again, just to cool the rising body heat in the packed room. Sylvie arrived early, as always. Calm. Poised. With that same quiet dignity that had now become a kind of symbol in the classroom. Samuel arrived late. But this time, no grin. His shoulders seemed heavier, his hair less perfectly styled. And in his hand, visible only to a few who noticed, was a slim, English-translated copy of the Qur'an. Professor Williams cleared his throat. "Today," he said, "we were supposed to discuss ethics and philosophy of law. But perhaps it's time we acknowledge that something deeper is happening here. So instead of a lecture, I will open the floor again, if both of you are willing." Sylvie nodded silently. Samuel hesitated, then slowly stood. "Before we dive into verse battles again," he said, forcing a dry smile, "I want to know something, Sylvie." She looked up. "You talk about this book like it's alive. Like it speaks. But to me, it just reads like poetry. Complicated foreign poetry." Sylvie stood too. Her voice was calm, as always. "That's because you're reading it with only your mind," she said. "But the Qur'an speaks best to the heart." He raised an eyebrow. "So I have to feel it to believe it? Isn't that what cults say?" Sylvie didn't flinch. "No. You have to listen with honesty. That's all. Not blind faith. Just open-hearted listening." Samuel crossed his arms. "Then show me. One passage. Just one. That proves this isn't just flowery Arabic." Sylvie opened her muse half. She didn't need to look at the page. She already knew where to go. "Surah Ar-Rahman," she said. Some students tilted their heads. "What's that?" someone whispered. Sylvie began to recite, not in Arabic first, but in English, so every heart in the room could hear. "The Most Merciful. He taught the Qur'an. He created man. He taught him eloquence. The sun and the moon move by precise calculation. And the stars and trees prostrate. And the heaven, he raised it and imposed the balance." Her voice was low, but carried. "So which of your Lord's favors will you deny?" Silence. She repeated the verse again. "Which of your Lord's favors will you deny?" Then she looked up at Samuel. "You asked for logic," she said. "But some truths don't just argue. They echo." Samuel's lips parted, but no words came. There was a crack in him now, no longer intellectual, but emotional. He tried to scoff. "Nice poetry," he muttered. "But still just words." Sylvie didn't respond. Instead, she quoted another verse, this time from Surah Fussilat. "If we had sent this Qur'an in a language other than Arabic, they would have said, 'Why are its verses not explained clearly?'" She paused. "But we made it in its original form, so that it would break through the pride of those who claim to understand everything." Samuel sat down abruptly. Not out of anger, but confusion. Or something dangerously close to awakening. His hands trembled slightly, gripping his desk. Then, unexpectedly, another student, Emily, raised her hand. She had never spoken in class before. I have a question," she said, her voice shaky. "Sylvie, you said the Qur'an honors women? That it protects rather than oppresses. Can you explain that? I've never heard it that way." Sylvie smiled gently. "Surah Al-Ahzab, verse 35, she replied. It says, 'Indeed, the Muslim men and Muslim women, the believing men and believing women, for all of them, Allah has prepared forgiveness and a great reward.'" She let the words settle. "In Islam," she continued, "value isn't based on appearance, or exposure, or fame. It's based on sincerity, character, connection to God. My hijab doesn't hide me. It reveals what really matters." Emily lowered her head, but not in shame. in thought. Samuel's eyes were red now. He wasn't arguing anymore. He was processing. And that shift, subtle, quiet, but undeniable, was what Sylvie had been praying for all along. Not to win an argument, but to soften a heart. When the session ended, no one rushed out. No one laughed. A kind of reverence had settled into the walls, as if the room itself had transformed. Professor Williams walked slowly to the window. Rain had begun to fall outside. Gentle, steady drops tapping against the glass. "I think," he said softly, "what we're witnessing isn't just a class." He turned to Sylvie. Then to Samuel. "It's a journey." Samuel remained seated long after everyone had left. He stared at the musehaf in his hand. Not like a skeptic, but like a man who just heard something call his name. The next class felt different. No announcements were made, no formal debate was scheduled, yet the classroom filled faster than ever before. Students sat closer, quieter. The usual chatter was replaced with a hushed energy, as if each person carried something unspoken within them. Sylvie entered early. As always, she took her usual seat by the window, placed her musehaf gently on the desk, and silently began jotting down notes. Not just for herself, but for anyone who might ask. She had started carrying a second copy of the Qur'an too, in English, just in case someone finally got the courage to request it. She had no idea how soon that moment would come. Outside, the rain from the day before had left everything damp and reflective. The campus trees shimmered under the weak morning light, and puddles mirrored a sky that was trying to clear. Sylvie's heart was steady. She no longer feared the eyes that once mocked her. In fact, many of those same eyes now followed her with curiosity, not malice. That was enough for her. What she didn't expect was the absence. Samuel hadn't arrived yet. He, who was always early. Who sat in the center seat. Who challenged, attacked, and owned the room with his presence. Now, he was missing. Professor Williams noticed it too. He glanced at the clock more than once. Cleared his throat but didn't begin. The room grew restless. Then, the door opened. All heads turned. Samuel stepped in slowly, not with his usual confidence, but with something else. Something quieter, heavier. His eyes were puffy, his hair disheveled. And in his hand, clear as day, was a paperback English translation of the Qur'an. The room held its breath. No one laughed. No one smirked. Not this time. Samuel walked toward the front of the class. He didn't take his usual seat. Instead, he turned to face everyone. "I need to say something," he said softly. Even Professor Williams didn't interrupt. Samuel's voice was not shaky, but it wasn't bold either. It was honest. "I've spent the last few nights reading. Really reading. Not to win a debate. Not to disprove anyone. Just reading." He held up the Qur'an slightly. "I read Surah Al-Hajj, verse 46. Do they not travel through the land, so that their hearts may thus learn wisdom and their ears may learn to hear? Truly it is not their eyes that are blind, but their hearts which are in their chests." He paused. And I realized, I've been blind. The classroom was silent. The kind of silence that doesn't come from shock, but from something sacred. I thought religion was chains. I thought it was submission to fear. But maybe, he looked down, maybe it was my arrogance that chained me. Sylvie felt her chest tighten. Not from pride. From hope. Samuel looked up again, this time directly at her. "I'm not saying I'm ready to convert. I'm not there yet. But for the first time in my life, I'm listening. And I can't explain it, but when you read Surah Ar-Rahman that day, something happened. Something in me cracked." A few students blinked back tears. Emily, the girl who had asked about women's rights, covered her mouth with her hand. Sylvie stood, not to preach, but simply to answer. You don't have to convert today, she said gently. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for. But if the light is knocking, don't close the door. She placed her hand gently on her chest. Surah Az-Zumar, verse 22, is one whose heart Allah has opened to Islam and is therefore upon a light from his Lord, like one who is hard-hearted. You don't need to see the end. Just take the first step. Samuel lowered his head. He gripped the Qur'an tightly. I want to learn, he whispered. I want to understand what you've been defending with so much peace. Professor Williams stepped forward slowly, emotion thick in his voice. In all my years of teaching, he said, I've seen many arguments. But today, I saw something else. I saw surrender. Not defeat, but the kind that leads to truth. He looked at Sylvie, then at Samuel. Thank you, both of you, for reminding us that intellect without humility is just noise. From that day forward, the classroom began to transform. It wasn't overnight. No miracle announcements. No dramatic conversions on the spot. But something had changed. Students began approaching Sylvie after class, asking questions not to attack, but to understand. Emily started sitting next to her. She stopped wearing heavy makeup. One day, she asked Sylvie if she could join her during prayer. Others followed. Small conversations turned into study sessions. Thursday afternoons, Sylvie began hosting informal Quran readings in the university's garden. Just simple gatherings. No preaching. No pressure. Just reading, in English, with discussion. Samuel came too. He didn't speak much at first. He would just sit, listening, watching. But every week he returned. And every week he stayed longer. One night he messaged Sylvie. Just a single sentence. I read Surah Al-Baqarah verse 2. This is the book in which there is no doubt, a guidance for the pious. I think I want to try becoming one of those. Sylvie cried that night. Not from sadness, but from gratitude. Weeks passed. Then, one day, after the prayer, something unexpected happened. Emily, standing in the university garden, surrounded by a few other students, all girls who had once mocked Sylvie, now stood hand in hand, eyes full of tears. She looked at Sylvie and said quietly, I'm ready. And there, with the leaves rustling above them and sunlight peeking through gray skies, they recited the Shahida. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. The words echoed softly, but their impact shook hearts. They weren't just accepting a religion. They were finding their way home. Sylvie stood back, eyes wet with joy. She hadn't forced. She hadn't convinced with pride or fire. She had simply stood her ground, with truth and love. And that had been enough. By the 6th week of the semester, the philosophy class at Massachusetts University no longer resembled what it once was. It was no longer a stage for ego-fueled debates. No longer a place where the Quran was mocked with smirks and sarcasm. The laughter had quieted. The arrogance had dissolved. And in its place, a kind of reverent silence had emerged. Sylvie noticed it immediately. Now when she walked into class, students didn't just glance at her, they looked at her with recognition. The kind of recognition one gives to someone who has weathered a storm and still stands with dignity. She wasn't the girl in the corner anymore. She was a flame in the fog. A few desks away, Samuel now arrived early. No longer taking the central spotlight. Instead, he sat slightly to the side, always with his English Quran in hand, sometimes underlined, sometimes bookmarked. His arrogance had not only left his voice, it had left his posture too. He no longer challenged everything. He now listened. That day's class began with a prompt by Professor Williams. I want you to think about the concept of divine justice versus human justice. Are they reconcilable? Or are they inherently at odds? It was a setup for another clash. Everyone expected Sylvie and Samuel to step forward. But something happened that no one saw coming. Another student, a quiet boy named Josh, who had never spoken a word in class before, raised his hand. I think I agree with Sylvie, he said nervously. I mean, if there's a God, wouldn't his justice be higher than ours by default? The professor raised an eyebrow, impressed. Sylvie smiled warmly but said nothing. Others joined in. A girl from the back row added, After reading parts of the Qur'an, I don't know, there's a clarity to it. Like it isn't trying to convince you. It just states things. With strength, but without arrogance. Samuel finally spoke. His voice was soft, but sure. I used to think the Qur'an was rigid. But now I think, maybe I was the one who was rigid. He turned to Sylvie. You said something weeks ago. That truth doesn't need to be shouted, it just needs to be witnessed. I didn't understand it then. But I do now. Sylvie nodded gently. It's never about forcing, she said. Truth is like light. It enters only through cracks. Outside class, the ripple effect was growing. The Thursday Qur'an sessions in the campus garden had grown from a handful of students to over 24. Some came with questions. Others with notebooks. Some just sat quietly, still unsure, but drawn nonetheless. Sylvie never lectured. She never argued. She would recite a verse, share its meaning, then ask one simple question. How does this verse speak to you? That was it. And slowly, week by week, hearts began to soften. One afternoon, as they finished discussing Surah Al-Kahf and its themes of youth, faith, and divine protection, Samuel lingered behind. Everyone else had left. The sky was golden. The leaves had begun to fall. He approached her slowly. Sylvie, he said, I'm afraid. She looked at him, surprised. Afraid of what? Of changing. He lowered his gaze. Of losing who I was. Of what people will say. What my family will say. What if they think I've lost my mind? Sylvie took a breath. Samuel, she said gently, you're not losing anything. You're finding something. Something that was always inside you, just waiting. She paused. Islam doesn't erase who you are. It restores you to your true self. He looked away, jaw clenched. But what if I never feel ready? She gave a half smile. None of us are ever fully ready. But when the heart begins to turn, that is readiness. It's not about perfection. It's about intention. He looked at the trees. I'm not sure I can carry the weight. Sylvie touched her Qur'an. You're not meant to carry it alone. That night, something happened. Sylvie was studying in her apartment when her phone buzzed. It was a message from Samuel. I read Surah Az-Zumar, verse 53. Say, O my servants who have transgressed against themselves, do not despair of the mercy of Allah. Indeed, Allah forgives all sins. Indeed, it is He who is the forgiving, the merciful. I cried. For the first time in years. I cried. I think I need to talk. Sylvie immediately replied. Come to the campus garden. I'm here. They met under the old tree where so many sessions had taken place. The moon was out. The sky was clear. Samuel walked in slowly, the Qur'an clutched in both hands. He sat beside her on the bench. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, with a trembling voice, he whispered, Why do I feel like something inside me is dying, but something else is being born? Sylvie didn't reply with theology. She just smiled and said, Because that's exactly what's happening. Over the next few days, Samuel stopped participating in the campus atheist forum. He deleted old posts mocking religion. He even apologized to several students, including one from India whom he had once insulted for being superstitious. But he still hadn't said the words. He hadn't crossed that final bridge. Until one chilly Friday afternoon. After the regular campus prayers had ended, and most students had already left, Samuel approached the imam who led the campus mosque. Sylvie stood beside him, quiet, heart pounding. "I'm ready," Samuel said. The imam smiled gently. "Are you sure?" Samuel nodded. "I've searched. I've fought. I've denied. But I've never felt more certain than I do right now." And with that, in a voice full of emotion, he said, "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah." The words came out trembling. But true. Sylvie's eyes filled with tears. Not just because he had become Muslim, but because he had found peace. That night, as she stood in prayer, Sylvie wept again, not from fear, not from loneliness, but from awe. She whispered to her Lord, "Ya Allah, I asked you for strength to defend your truth. But you gave me more than that. You let me witness a soul return to you." And far away, under a sky full of stars, a boy who once mocked the Qur'an now held it close, like a map he never knew he needed. It had only been 3 days since Samuel uttered the Shahada, yet to him, it felt like a lifetime had passed. Everything around him looked the same: the campus buildings, the students walking past him, the rustling leaves of autumn. But within him, a world had changed. He saw with different eyes now. He heard things differently. Even the silence felt fuller. But with this inner transformation came an unexpected wave of stillness and loneliness. Converting to Islam had been a moment of spiritual euphoria, but the days that followed brought challenges he hadn't anticipated. His group chats had gone silent. A few classmates unfollowed him. A well-known student blog on campus posted a passive-aggressive article titled, "When Bright Minds Fall for Bronze Age Fairy Tales." He didn't even have to read it to know it was about him. He sat under a tree that afternoon, alone, with the Qur'an in his lap, rereading Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 2 again and again. This is the book in which there is no doubt, a guidance for those who are mindful of Allah. But today, doubt wasn't in the book. It was in him. Had he been too hasty? Would he lose everything? His scholarships, his reputation, his future? Then he saw her. Sylvie. Walking toward him slowly, like a calm breeze approaching a wildfire. She sat down without speaking. He looked at her, trying to smile. "I think I underestimated how hard this would be," he said. Sylvie nodded gently. "It's never easy to walk against the current." Samuel sighed. "People are distant now. Some think I've been brainwashed. Others think I'm going through a phase. A few just look at me like I've betrayed them." She listened quietly. "Did you ever feel like this?" he asked. "All the time," she said. "Even back home. Even among other Muslims. Being visibly faithful always invites criticism, from those who lost theirs, and from those who never had it." He didn't speak for a moment. Then, slowly, he whispered, "Sometimes I wish I could just be invisible again." Sylvie looked at him with soft intensity. "Don't wish that," she said. "The world already has too many people hiding. Too many people afraid to stand. You were given light, don't dim it now." That Friday, Samuel came to Jummah for the first time. He sat in the back, unsure if he was doing everything right. His jeans were wrinkled, his head bare, his notes tucked in his pocket like they could anchor him to something familiar. When the imam began the khutbah, the sermon, Samuel was surprised by how calm he felt. There was no yelling. No fire and brimstone. Just verses. Stories. Wisdom. And then the imam said something that pierced through the wall in Samuel's chest. When the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, came to Medina, the people didn't all convert in a day. What they saw was his truth, his mercy, his consistency. And slowly, hearts changed. Not through argument, but through presence. Samuel lowered his head. Presence. That was what Sylvie had shown him all along. That night, Sylvie and a few other Muslim students hosted a quiet dinner for Samuel. It wasn't a celebration. It wasn't loud. It was just warmth and welcome. Emily was there too, now wearing a simple beige scarf. She sat beside Samuel and smiled shyly. "I still don't know everything," she said. "But I know this feels real." Samuel laughed softly. "That makes two of us." They sat outside afterward, under the string lights draped across the garden patio. The air was cold, but their hearts were full. A student from Nigeria named Kareem handed Samuel a prayer mat and a small booklet titled, "My First Salah." Samuel held it like it was fragile. "Is it okay that I don't know what to say yet?" he asked. Kareem grinned. "Brother, even the Prophet's companions didn't learn everything in a day. Start with intention. Allah will teach you the rest." The next morning, Samuel woke up early. He hadn't planned to. His alarm hadn't even gone off. But he just woke. The campus was silent. The sky still blue-gray with pre-dawn chill. He sat up, took the prayer mat from his desk, and opened the little booklet. It wasn't perfect. He stumbled through the Arabic. He had to check the positions twice. But when he bowed his head in sujud, forehead to floor, whispering whatever words came, his heart broke. Not from pain, but from surrender. From the relief of no longer needing to control everything. He cried quietly on the carpet, whispering, "I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm here." And in that moment he knew. That was enough. On campus, the ripple effects continued. The Thursday Quran circles now had to be moved from the garden to a small lecture hall due to the growing number of attendees. More students were asking questions, not just out of curiosity, but hunger. Hunger for something that made sense. Something that felt real in a world full of filters, pressure, and empty praise. Sylvie had become something unexpected, not a preacher, not a leader, but a mirror. Someone in whose calm presence others began to see themselves. And Samuel. He had become proof. Proof that even the hardest skeptic could fall, not to fear, but to light. One afternoon, Professor Williams stopped Sylvie as class ended. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I've taught moral philosophy for 22 years," he said. "And I've watched countless students shift opinions, change views, play intellectual chess." He paused. "But I've never seen what happened here." Sylvie said nothing. He continued, "I didn't believe truth could still move people. Not like this. But maybe I've been too cynical." He looked away for a moment, then whispered something that caught Sylvie off guard. "Maybe I need to read that book too." That night, Samuel sat outside on a bench facing the old philosophy building. His Quran rested beside him. The stars were out, and for the first time in years, he looked up at them not with questions, but with awe. He messaged Sylvie one line. "Thank you for standing, even when no one else did." Sylvie replied, "I wasn't standing alone. I had truth beside me." And far above them, in a sky that had watched their entire journey, the moon shone brightly, not proud, not loud, just present. Just like them. The last week of the semester arrived faster than anyone expected. Yet no one could deny, this philosophy class had become something else entirely. It was no longer just about logic, debates, and syllogisms. No longer about dissecting Kant, Nietzsche, or utilitarian theory. The classroom had become something sacred, a place where minds opened, but more importantly, hearts did too. Sylvie noticed it in small moments. Students who once mocked her now offered warm smiles. Young women who once giggled at her hijab now wore their own, shyly at first, then with confidence. Boys who once scoffed at faith now sat quietly in the Thursday Quran circle, asking questions like, "How did the Prophet treat his enemies?" Or, "What does Tawbah actually mean?" Even the professor had changed. He no longer treated Islam like an abstract topic. He referenced it with respect, even curiosity. One day, after class, he admitted to Sylvie that he'd started reading the Qur'an in private. Just to understand what made Samuel cry, he said with a faint smile. And Samuel? He was no longer a student struggling with belief. He was now someone walking with it. It showed in his eyes, softer now, less restless. It showed in his speech, measured, humble. And it showed in his choices, skipping Friday parties to attend Jummah, spending late nights memorizing short surahs, helping others who had once ridiculed him understand the book he now held dear. The last day of class arrived. The final lecture was meant to be a review of everything they'd learned: ethics, relativism, free will, the nature of good and evil. But Professor Williams had something else in mind. He walked in holding a single sheet of paper. I was going to give a summary, he said, but instead, I want you to hear something. He cleared his throat. This was an anonymous submission from a student in this class. He began reading. I used to think truth was what you could prove in a lab or find in a formula. I thought faith was an excuse for the weak. That belief was the easy way out of hard questions. Then I met someone who didn't argue back, didn't shout, didn't fight, but simply stood. She didn't preach. She didn't demand. She just lived her truth, even when it cost her everything. And it made me wonder, what if truth doesn't have to be loud to be real? The room was utterly silent. Not a cough. Not a shuffle. Not even a whisper. Samuel lowered his head. He had written it. Everyone knew. But no one said a word. They didn't need to. After class, something extraordinary happened. One by one, students approached Sylvie, not for debate, not for challenge, but for gratitude. Emily hugged her, tears in her eyes. I would have never known what peace felt like if I hadn't watched you pray. Kareem, the Nigerian student, handed Samuel a small misbaha, prayer beads, and said, Use this when the world feels heavy. It works. Even Professor Williams paused at the door, turned around, and said to the class, What happened here will stay with me for the rest of my life. Then he looked at Sylvie and added, And it started because one person refused to be silent. Outside, the sky was clear. The wind carried that early winter bite, sharp, clean, and almost electric, with the feeling of something ending, yet something greater beginning. Samuel and Sylvie walked side by side across the campus lawn. Not close enough to break boundaries. Just close enough to share silence. I still don't feel like I know everything, Samuel said softly. Sylvie smiled. You never will. He chuckled. That's comforting. A pause. Then he asked, Do you think I'll ever be strong like you? Sylvie looked at him, really looked. You already are, she said. You just don't realize it yet. The Thursday Qur'an session that week was the biggest one yet. They had moved it to the university's multipurpose room, and still students stood along the walls. That day, Sylvie didn't lead. She asked Samuel to read. He hesitated, but the room waited. Then he opened his Qur'an, turned to Surah Ash-Shar, the relief, and began. Did we not expand for you your chest? And we removed from you your burden, which had weighed upon your back, and raised high for you your repute. For indeed, with hardship will be ease. Indeed, with hardship will be ease. He paused. His voice cracked. Not from nerves, but from knowing that the verse was him. Every word, every line, described his journey. He closed the Qur'an. The room remained still. Then, softly, gently, Sylvie said, Now do you see why we say it's not just a book? He nodded, tears in his eyes. Yes, he whispered. It's home. That night, after everyone had left and the lights were turned off, Sylvie stayed behind. She walked across the now empty room, her fingertips brushing over the tables where arguments once raged and where hearts had now softened. She stepped outside into the freezing air, raised her head to the sky, and smiled. A single snowflake landed on her scarf. Pure. Unannounced. Transformative. Like guidance. Sometimes, the most powerful dawah isn't a speech, a lecture, or a fiery debate. It's a single person, holding to truth with grace. One soul standing with dignity, can change dozens of hearts. And the Qur'an, the book once mocked, now echoes in their voices. Because when truth is real, it doesn't just win arguments. It awakens souls.